はい、皆様、お時間になりましたので、開始させていただきます。本日はお忙しいところ、NGO2030 企画のウェビナー、今何が起きている第2弾、グローバル・ヒューマニタリアン・アシスタンス2025レポートから考える人道支援の現状にご参加いただきましてありがとうございます。私は2030、NGO2030 メンバーで、ジャパンプラットフォームの高杉と申します。本日、司会をさせていただきます。よろしくお願いいたします。最初に簡単にですね、NGO2030 についてご説明させてください。NGO2030 とはですね、団体の垣根を越えた有志からなるグループで、2030年に向けた日本の NGO セクターの在り方を議論し、3つの方向性と10のアクションプランをもとに、ウェビナー、このセクターの改善などのイニシアチブを実行しています。背景としては、NGO2030 の主要メンバーのアメリカの視察に始まり、アメリカの NGO が政策などにも重要なパートナーであることを学んだ、そのことから2018年に発足し、その後も有志として活動を継続しております。3つの方向性と10のアクションプランについては、今日はメインのトピックではないので、詳細は省きますが、ご興味のある方はぜひ QR コードにアクセスしてください。はい、イベント本題に入りたいと思います。今年1月ですね、アメリカの大統領令によって USAID、米国国際開発局への資金拠出が停止されました。アメリカだけでなく、その後も各国が人道支援へのコミットを削減したり、軍事費を増強したり、増やす傾向にあり、支援を必要とする人々への甚大な影響が懸念されています。一方でですね、日本国内においては、詳細の影響などが報道されることは多くありません。日本の私たちも共に考えて、共有する場が必要ではないかと、本ウェビナーが開催されました。本日は人道支援セクターの動向を研究、観測し、世界的に参照されるレポートを、最前線で作ってきたアルナップのジェニファー・ドハティさん、そして、実際に現場で何が起こっているのか共有くださるワールドビジョンジャパンの緊急人道開発支援をご担当されている、伊藤真理さんをお招きしております。前回ですね、4月に開催した第1弾のウェビナーの反響もとても大きかったですが、今回も90名以上の皆さんに参加申し込みをいただいております。皆さんと共に考える機会となれば幸いです。少し事務的なお知らせとなります。ウェビナー中は音声はミュートでお願いします。カメラはオンでもオフでも構いません。ウェビナーの中のコメントや質問は、Zoom 画面下のチャット欄よりお書き込みいただけます。本日ですね、ジェニファーさんは英語でご発表いただきますが、Zoom の日本語音声翻訳を活用しますので、皆さんの画面の右下に字幕ボタンがあるのをオンにして、会話言語と字幕言語の両方を日本語を選んでください。AI ではありますが、字幕が表示されますので、ぜひご活用ください。それから本日のウェビナーは、録画させていただき、後日公開予定になります。一旦7時で終わりますが、放課後トークとして、そのまま、参加者の皆さんと自由に意見交換できる場を予定していますので、ぜひご参加ください。はい。では、早速ですが、アルナップのシニアリサーチフェローのジェニファー・ドハティさんより、グローバル・ヒューマニタリアン・アシスタンスの最新レポートを共有いただきます。ここからファシリテーターの、CWS ジャパン事務局長の小見野武さんにマイクをお渡ししたいと思います。小見野さん、ジェニファーさん、よろしくお願いいたします。
はい、高杉さんありがとうございました。皆さん、こんにちは。CW ジャパンの小見野と申します。本日はご参加いただきましてありがとうございます。本日のジェニファーさんの発表はですね、英語で実施をいたします。なので、字幕でですね、翻訳字幕を表示させることができますので、字幕の右側のこの矢印がありまして、その翻訳をオンにして、私の会話言語と字幕言語とありますので、それを日本語に 設定をしていただけると、翻訳字幕が表示されます。ので、よろしくお願いいたします。Okay. Jennifer, then let's first go with your presentation to outline what's happening in this humanitarian sector with all the funding cuts and the difficult circumstance that we're all facing today. Over to you.
Great, thank you. I'm delighted to be here today to talk to you about this new report on humanitarian financing, which is a crucial topic in this time of cuts, as has already been mentioned. You may be aware that ALNAP has not traditionally produced the annual Global Humanitarian Assistance report, or as I'll refer to it, the GHA. So Development Initiatives was an organization that produced the report for many years, but unfortunately they closed last year as part of the funding cuts in the sector. And when that happened, we didn't want to see the sector lose such an important resource for credible and transparent information on the system's funding. And we're not the only ones, thankfully, who were worried about that loss. So with the help of 3 government donors, Canada, Denmark, and the UK, we've been able to take on the report with funding for 2 editions. And I'm pleased to share the first edition with you today, which was led by some former Development Initiative staff, with Mike Pearson, my colleague now, as the lead. So the GHA tells the story of the state of humanitarian finances. And in this presentation, there will be a lot of charts and numbers. It may be difficult for you to see if you have the translation function open, but hopefully we can share the report and the presentation if you'd like to see more details more clearly. So before I get into the detailed sections of the reports, I will just share with you our core 3 messages. So the first one is that we've not just reached the cliff edge on funding, we've gone past it. So we saw the biggest percentage drop in over a decade, and that was before the cuts that were announced earlier this year that we've been talking about. The second is that humanitarian reform is under pressure. Localization, cash, anticipatory action, and the use of pooled funds. There's not one area where we saw real progress. And finally, this has been a turning point for protracted crises. Where possible, we should be moving away from humanitarian support in these contexts. But the data shows this is not happening. So in the first section of the report, we'll move on to looking at some of the big numbers. And there's no bigger number than how much did the sector receive last year. So the sector peaked at $46.1 billion in 2022, but since then it has been shrinking. Last year, the humanitarian sector received an estimated $41 billion, which was a 10% drop. This is the biggest drop since 2012. In absolute terms, the sector lost a huge $5 billion. And this was driven by reductions in funding from governments, but also from private donors. And this reduction comes on the back of increases that we saw since COVID in 2020 and an escalation in Ukraine in 2022. With both those effects since waning, now donors are cutting their funding, and we see this now. So to zero in on this region, Japanese funding was down 13% in 2024. From $1.3 billion to $1.2 billion. Now, this is not a hugely significant drop compared to other countries. And it's important to note that from 2023, Japanese funding peaked at $1.3 billion, which is far beyond its historical norm. So to put that in context, from 2013 to 2022, the average was $720 million. So even with that decline in 2024, Japan's funding is still well above its historical norm. And Japan is the 6th largest donor in the system, far beyond many European countries like France, Netherlands, Canada, and Norway. So we've also been looking at what the system is likely to look like by the end of this year, with many key donors here announcing cuts. Now, Japan is one of the few top humanitarian donors that is upping their overseas development assistance, or ODA, in 2025. So this is ODA as a whole. We weren't able to get information on plans for Japan's humanitarian assistance specifically from the announcements that have been publicly made, but there's not yet a reason to think that humanitarian assistance will go down in comparison to development spending unless those priorities have recently shifted. So considering those projected changes by different donors, we've tried to create 3 scenarios for what public donor spending might look like by the end of this year. In the optimistic case, we see $25 billion in 2025, and in the pessimistic case, 21 billion. The moderate case here is in the middle. And these scenarios suggest a 34 to 45% decline on the 2023 peak in assistance. Or if we compare it to 2024, that's 28 to 39%. So some quite big cuts. And which of these scenarios is most likely to play out? So a lot of this depends on US funding. If we see the US cutting their spending by anything less than 60% and other donors prioritize humanitarian spending, then the optimistic case could be more likely. But if we see the US cut by more than 80% and others deprioritize humanitarian contributions, then the pessimistic case is more likely. So we don't know the exact size of what the cuts will be, but we did want to think about which crisis-affected contexts are exposed to those cuts. So what might this mean practically for contexts that rely on funding? We looked at which ones receive the most funding from donors who've announced their cuts and budget decreases. So this mainly relates to funding from the US, the UK, Germany, Sweden, Belgium, France, Denmark, and the Netherlands. So here, if we look at that exposure, we see that it varies by context, but there are 10 recipient countries who received 70% or more of their funding from donors who've announced those cuts. So they have very high exposure. Looking at the US, they were the largest donor to 10 most exposed countries that we've labeled on this chart. And some of these highest exposure contexts were already receiving the lowest funding requirements. For example, Ethiopia only had 30% of its funding requirements met in 2024. Or Uganda, it was 34%, Colombia 41%, and Jordan 46%. And you may notice that all of these contexts have strong refugee responses. So we see a relationship here with donor fatigue. These countries have a smaller pool of donors than some of the newer, higher profile contexts, which leads to a higher exposure to these cuts that we're seeing. And I think we'll hear more about one of these cases in Uganda in the next presentation to give that some more context. And we can also see here that some of the higher funded responses are least dependent on those cuts. So Palestine, Ukraine, and Yemen, not surprisingly, these are higher profile crises with a wider donor pool and interest and are less exposed to these current cuts. So again, I'll zoom back into the Japanese picture and areas where Japan's spending is more concentrated. So the top agencies funded by Japan are UNRWA, UNFPA, and the WHO. So in this sense, the profile is actually quite different from other donors. The top UN agencies funded by others tends to be WFP, UNHCR, and UNICEF. And none of those agencies are most dependent on Japanese funding. Instead, there's more engagement with health spaces. And indeed, you can see that health is the sector that is most dependent on Japanese funding. So 19% of humanitarian health funding comes from Japan, a top donor in this sector. And this is followed by protection and early recovery. So this is a different picture again to other donors. We could look at the US, which was focused more on food security, nutrition, and logistics. And then finally on this slide, we look at pooled funds. And this is something I will come back to when I talk about the current reform agendas. Japan gives a minimal amount into either the Central Emergency Relief Fund or country-based pooled funds. You know, this isn't nothing, taking less than $3 million to country-based pooled funds in 2024, but it shows up as a 0% because of the size in comparison to the whole. So just lastly in this section, I want to look quickly at in-donor refugee costs. This is maybe becoming more controversial at the moment. So often in-donor refugee costs are counted as overseas development assistance. And these can be multiple times the size of international humanitarian assistance. So the UK, Germany, Canada, Italy, the Netherlands, France, Switzerland, Ireland, and Belgium all spend more on their in-donor refugee costs in their own context rather than international humanitarian assistance as part of their ODA. So the implication is that these donors maybe don't have to spend as much internationally on ODA because a portion of their own hosting costs count towards that total. But in comparison, Japan is one of the few top humanitarian donors that spends more on international humanitarian assistance than domestic refugees spend. So just to summarize that first section, we're now in a humanitarian recession. Funding was already being squeezed in 2024, and moving into this year, 2025, we could be in a humanitarian Great Depression. As we have looked at in those scenarios, there could be huge drops this year. And the short-term reaction we're seeing is to cut costs, prioritize, and do less. We could try to find more money, but the question is, where would that money come from? But longer-term strategies are starting to evolve. We're all hearing talk about the humanitarian reset, UN80, or changes with the Grand Bargain, but not necessarily clarity on what those mean or how different actors are really engaged in those processes. Beyond asking what the size of the sector will be going forward, we can also think about, does the system need to reform and transform in order to meet the needs of affected populations within this new reality? So as I highlighted here, the funding picture for the humanitarian sector is fairly bleak, but it's heartening to see contexts like Japan maintaining the commitment to humanitarian response. But how this happens and what reforms are incentivized will be just as important as the quantities of funding that are provided. So this chart is quite complex and maybe easier to see in the report, but it shows the agencies through which humanitarian funding flows based on the financial tracking services data and also data from UNHCR's partner database. We have two layers here of first and second level recipients. However, there continues to be very poor reporting and visibility on the second level recipients. with over $25 billion unaccounted for past that first recipient level. So this unfortunately hampers our ability to track indirect funding that goes to local and national actors. But if we just look at this first recipient level here, the proportion of funding that goes directly to multilateral organizations and INGOs has stayed roughly the same for the past 5 years, at around 60 to 66% for multilaterals and 18% for INGOs. In 2024, 61% of public donor funding was provided to multilateral organizations, and the largest recipients of this were the World Food Programme and UNHCR. And after those multilaterals, the largest group of recipients was INGOs, which received again around 18% of primary donor funding. And given those figures haven't really changed over the past 5 years, you might expect to see that funding to local and national actors has also stayed the same. Or maybe, given the efforts we've all been talking about in the sector, maybe we could see an increase. But in fact, the reality is actually a little bit worse. So in 2024, as funding overall dropped by 11%, we saw the sector also backslide on recent increases in funding to local and national actors. Funding to local actors in real value and its percentage fell in 2024. Percentage-wise, it fell by 14%, down to 7.5% total funding, and 3.6% of all international humanitarian assistance went directly to local and national actors. And this is despite the fact that country-based pooled funds are increasing their funding to local actors. And you may hear that many people look to country-based pooled funds as a way of getting more funding to local actors. And indeed, funding to local actors in those funds increased to 35% direct funding and 45% funding overall in 2024. And this was at the same time that funding to UN agencies fell within these types of country-based pooled funds. But this didn't necessarily lead to that increase for local and national actors overall, because the volume of funding to country-based pooled funds declined since 2022. It was $1.2 billion US, and now it's down to just $900 million in 2024. So we don't see that large overall increase to local and national actors as direct funding. And this is why it is so important for us to approach these different reform proposals we're hearing at the moment with a really close look at the specific targets being proposed and how they interact with one another. I'll just illustrate this on this chart. So our GHA team looked at some of the recent proposals we're hearing in reforms talking about pooled funds, in thinking about how they might get more money to local and national actors. And so here we can see the track of funding to country-based pooled funds over time. And these last 3 bars here are all models of some of the recent proposals we've heard. So first, we have the grand bargain proposal of 15% to country-based pooled funds, but with a target of 70% going to local and national actors. So that's the purple bar here on this first model in the grey. Next to that, we have the Emergency Relief Coordinator's original proposal in the humanitarian reset of putting 33% of international humanitarian assistance to country-based pooled funds. And initially, this had no target for local and national actors. And if we assume that similar percentages go to them that we saw in 2024, then we can see that the bar here is not actually that different. The purple is pretty much the same as for the other proposal by the Grand Bargain, which has a lot less money coming into country-based pooled funds, but similar amounts going to local and national actors. Finally, on this last bar, we have the more recent proposal we heard in June from the Humanitarian Reset and Tom Fletcher, that they would go up to 50% of funding to country-based pooled funds, and now putting in a target for local and national actors of 70%. And that could make a huge difference here, as long as the increases do go to country-based pooled funds and these targets happen, which, as we know, looking in the sector, we don't always reach the targets that we put for ourselves. So the reality will be important to see. But all of this is just to illustrate that it's really about looking at how things are set up properly to work for local and national actors, and not making assumptions that these types of funds will automatically support them more effectively. So I'll just move on to two other reform areas, and we're seeing a similar pattern here. So on the left, we have cash and voucher-based assistance that has been falling steadily since 2022, both in volume and the percentage of overall international humanitarian assistance, after a peak of 23.9% in 2022. And there was no clear single explanation for this decline, but there were a few potential reasons, like the shift to in-kind assistance in Ukraine, which comprises a major amount of humanitarian response funding, but also the natural ebbs and flows in other responses that have shifted more to in-kind support or wound down. Then on the right-hand side, this chart is on anticipatory action. And the story here is more stagnation than decline. These numbers are also of a lower scale than we talk about localization or cash. So here it's millions instead of billions. But the volume of funding made available for anticipatory action stagnated in 2024. And the volume dispersed fell from the previous year, despite the number of activations increasing. So we've seen more activations per year, and these have mainly been for weather-related events. But the average disbursement per activation fell significantly. So the takeaways on humanitarian reform are first that we're seeing a backsliding. And given that this happened when the sector faced only an 11% decline in funding, this is not really a good sign for what 2025 might hold in terms of how the system sets its priorities when cutting funding. And finally, the devil is in the details on reform proposals. And donors need to look at the interplay of different targets and numbers with one another rather than in isolation. So on to the final section, we're seeing a potential turning point for protracted crises, which have dominated the humanitarian caseload for well over a decade now. And we can see this in three key statistics. So the first set of statistics is about overall overseas development assistance in protracted crises. We see a huge explosion in overall humanitarian development and peace funding to protracted crises that have a humanitarian response plan, going from $29 billion in 2019 to $67 billion in 2023. So that is more than double. But there is a huge caveat to this. So if we look at this graph, 97% of that increase in overseas development assistance is due to Ukraine. If you look at this orange line and look at the first three bars, other protracted crises received $28 billion across these 5 years. So a clear leveling off of ODA and other protracted crises where we see this staying pretty much the same. So while that is leveling off, we can look at that mix of overseas development assistance. And here we have a troubling milestone. So when we again take out Ukraine, we see a crossover moment in 2023 where humanitarian aid overtook development assistance, 48 to 44%, and peace declined to 4% of ODA in protracted settings. This seems to run counter to the OECD Nexus recommendation, prevention always, development wherever possible, and humanitarian action only where necessary. And finally, if we consider humanitarian funding trends overall, we can see that the fate of protractedness has really driven the humanitarian funding story over the past 15 years. With the drops we're witnessing now, it seems to be the end of a nearly 15% era of significant growth in humanitarian aid. And over that time, we saw two periods of big increases. So one I talked about already between 2020 and 2023, driven by COVID-19 pandemic and Ukraine. But there was an earlier one between 2012 and 2017, where funding increased at a much higher rate than it ever had before, a doubling of international humanitarian assistance in just 5 years. And a driver of that was the rise in protracted crises. And we saw a reverse of a 2-decade trend of a decline in conflicts. And then we saw development funding already dropping in extremely fragile settings. And that increase in conflicts has not stopped, and they don't seem to be ending and are leading to more protracted crises. So as a result of all of this, humanitarian aid has shot up, and protracted crises draw increasingly on humanitarian assistance. In 2024, this reached a high point of 94% of all country allocable humanitarian aid. And this high caseload of protracted crises is particularly salient today for the sector where we're facing significant cuts. So to summarize, we're seeing development and peace funding in protracted crises stalling. And while humanitarian funding has increased, this shows how much the international community is relying on humanitarian responses as its primary solution to long-term conflict and crisis. And this means that when we look within the humanitarian funding space specifically, protracted crisis now dominates. So what does all this mean? If it feels like the sector is pulling itself apart at the moment, it's because it's moving in two different directions. On the one hand, it's moving backwards, back in smaller size, not seen since 2014, and also backwards in thinking in some areas, as we see shifts away from cash and localization. So we're not really going back to the future, we're moving forward to the past. But at the same time, there's a scrabble to adapt and change with a spectrum of what actors want to see from this future system with reduced funds. There are potential opportunities to do things differently, but also real fears that concerns for individual mandates or protection of jobs will prevail over the lives and dignity of people affected by crisis. We also need to rethink the nexus. We often talk about toolkits and tick boxes, but we need a wholesale strategic rethink. In a future where we see massive cuts to overseas development of service, we're at risk of seeing a self-fulfilling prophecy where protractedness deepens and humanitarian is prioritized, as opposed to us really trying to address those root causes of protracted crisis across the nexus. And if humanitarians are going to step back from those contexts, we need to think about why they stepped in the first place and whether those situations for people affected have really changed. Stepping back could be just redrawing boundaries around who does and who does not get basic care based on reasons that can seem quite arbitrary. So there is a lot of data in what I've just discussed, and there's more in the report that hopefully you can see in better detail and take time to think through. And we look forward to discussing some of these issues with you, and especially talking about how the system might prioritize within this changed environment. I do just briefly want to share one update on another key piece of ALNAP's work. And this is the State of the Humanitarian System report that we started assessing the overall performance of the humanitarian system back in 2007, and we are now on the 6th edition of this report that we produce every 3 to 4 years. And as well as drawing on the kind of financial analysis that I just talked about, this report explores various aspects of system performance. So looking at effectiveness, whether the system is living up to its principles in places of conflict. And in this edition, we'll be exploring whether the system has prioritized effectively in these periods of cuts and change. We draw in a huge amount of primary and secondary data from different parts of the system, including from people affected by crisis, but also by the reports and evaluations created by your organizations. And we also have a survey out at the moment for aid practitioners that your colleagues may find of interest. So we would really like to keep engaging with members of this group on the creation of that next report and also sharing its findings with you next year, with the ultimate aim of improving policy and practice for people affected by crisis. So I hope we can continue to be in touch, and I thank you for your time and your patience with all those small graphs.
Thank you, Jennifer. Appreciate all your insights. It is really alarming to see we're observing this contracting, the growth of the sector for the last years. So we're pretty much looking at losing all the growth that we had in the sector for the last 10 years. All the focus around the cash and voucher assistance is also declining. Investment into anticipatory action is stagnated. Less money going into preventing the actual crisis. And as you said, it makes me feel that we all need in our sector come out from status quo and have an innovation mindset. But yeah, I think the most difficult question would be how we're going to go about this, but this is something maybe we can discuss more. Okay, but thank you, Jennifer. Let me turn to Japanese. はい、ジェニファーさんありがとうございました。次はですね、日本語での発表になります。ワールドビジョンジャパンの、伊藤真理さん。伊藤さんは、リベリア、スーダン、南スーダン、こういった国々での駐在経験を経て、2010年からですね、東京事務所で勤務をされておりまして、中近東の地域における災害対応チームメンバーでもあります。先ほどジェニファーさんがどちらかというと非常にマクロな現状をお話しくださったのに対して、伊藤さんからは、そういった現状が現場で見るとどういったことが起きているのか、こういったことをお話しいただければと思っております。じゃあ伊藤さん、どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。
ありがとうございます。お時間いただきありがとうございます。見えてますか？はい。今ご紹介いただきました、ワールドビジョンジャパンの、伊藤と申します。今日は本当に、よろしくお願いいたします。本当に今、ジェニファーさんが、マクロレベルでの、数字ですね、特に資金削減の規模とか、構造的なその課題っていうのが、示されて、そういう意味で、でも数字だけでは見えない、現場の、声がありまして、今日の参加者の方々の中でも、現場で働かれている方もいらっしゃるので、ぜひ後で伺いたいなと思います。で、ここからは、本当に実際に起きていることを、たくさんある、影響を受けた国々の中で、特に、ウガンダの具体例をですね、の事例と、人の視点ですね、ヒューマンストーリーからですね、ご紹介したいなというふうに思っています。はい。ちょっと待ってね。すいません。はい。はい。というところで、ウガンダ、ご存知の通り、アフリカ最大の難民の受け入れ国というところで、約180万人の、難民を、受け入れていますと。で、うち、8割弱ですね、が、78% が女性と子供というところで、特に保護が必要な層が 多く含まれていますと。で、次にですね、最近の動向として、2025年に入ってからですね、新たに南スーダン、DRC から、もう12万人以上の難民が流入していて、受け入れ体制への負荷が急速に、高まっていますと。だから資金的なチャレンジもありつつ、本当にオンゴーイングでですね、流入してきているというところです。で、例えばですね、現場の課題としてここにもちょっと挙げたんですけど、難民の受け入れセンター、中バンデってところにあるんですが、そこは定員の6倍を超える、状況というところで、人が、滞在していると。こういう状況からですね、本当に衛生とか安全とか、教育など多方面に深刻な影響を及ぼしているというところが見られるかなと思います。次のスライドからですね、具体的な影響を皆さんと一緒に少し見ていきたいなと思っています。はい、1分ぐらい、ビデオを一緒に見たいと思います。これはですね、ウガンダの現場北部ですね。で、はい。
Uganda hosts over 1.8 million refugees coming from different countries. But right now, because of the reduced funding, 64% of those are not receiving any food. It's really very sad because it does not necessarily mean that they have food at their homes. What this means is that as others behind here are receiving cash assistance, they are not receiving anything. You can imagine the motivation of going to a different country for you to be hosted is probably to get food, is to get cash assistance. But when you come to a country, those things are not available. And yet back in your country, there is war. That's a very sad situation. And they are caught in between two hard decisions, to die out of war or to die out of hunger. And this is a very sad situation.
We have two categories of people who are getting the cash. One, we have category 2. Category
という感じでですね、これ、あともう1分ぐらい続くんですけれども、今言ってた通り、多くの難民が来て、食料を受け取れない方もいいとか、で、また、戦争を逃れて、安全なところに逃げてきたけれども、そこでは食料がなくっていうところで、本当に国にも帰れないし、ここに残ったら本当に餓死を待つしかないっていう、本当に大変な状況であるというところをですね、現場の、スタッフからの報告がありました。じゃあ、ちょっと次に行きます。はい。ごめんなさい。はい。というところで、ちょっと書き足になっちゃうんですけども、まずですね、一つ、これから3枚ですね、一緒に3つの事例を見ていきたいと思います。まず1つ目ですね、資金削減によって、食料支援の削減状況について、少しお話したいと思います。で、WFP のこの、資金難っていうのは、この USAID の問題以前からですね、以前からあってですね、で、ここにも書いてる食料配給率、ちょっとピンとこないと思うんですけど、通常は 100% フルでもらえるところをですね、すでに以前は 30% まで減らされてたのが、今は 22%、本当は 100% もらえるところ、資金難っていうところでですね、より多くの人たちに、必要な人たちに支援が届けられるようにってことで、配給率を下げて、22% まで削減されているというところです。また新しく到着した、難民への初期の支援も本来は 100% のところが6割までに、6割に削減されていると。これによって特に、新規到着者の生活は非常に、厳しいものとなっているということです。で、特に影響を受けている人々についてですけれども、影響は深刻で、難民世帯の 38% が3分の1ですねが、WFP の食料や現金給付を主な食料の入手手段としています。特にビディビデ居住地では 64% とインペピですね、居住地は 61% と、割合が高くなっています。その背景は先ほど最初のスライドにもあった通り、女性や子供 高齢者とか、非常に脆弱な方々が多いというところが、この、ですね、パーセントが高い、要因になっています。というところで、多くの人々が支援なしでは生活ができない今状況にある。で、こちらの右側の写真は、ねんさちゃんっていう、女の子のおばあさんですね。おばあさんって60歳の方ですけども、で、空の鍋ですね。ここ見えるんですけど、火が灯ってなくてですね、冷えたかまどの上に置かれて、調理すらできない現実を、象徴しているというところで、こうした状況っていうのは、ねんさちゃんのおばあちゃんだけではなくて、今や多くの家庭で、それが日常になっているというところです。はい。で、次は、次のスライドは、今回は、食料、水、栄養についても、深刻な状況にあります。まず、母子保健や栄養支援のプログラムっていうのが停止されて、一部の保健センターも閉鎖されていますと。これにより、特に子どもや妊産婦への医療アクセスが、大きく、制限されています。で、次に、水の問題です。1人当たり1日平均、水供給量っていうのは、以前は17リットルだったんですけれども、今12リットルに、減少しています。で、泣きバレ、ちょっと発音があれですけれども、これ難民キャンプすいません、難民居住地なんですけれども、では、6リットル未満の、日もあり、スフィアスタンダードの15リットルを大きく、下回っていると。で、右のグラフはですね、ご覧いただくと、今お伝えした泣きバレっていうところは、53% の世帯が十分な、飲料水にアクセスできないことがわかりますと。で、他の地域でも同様に深刻な状況が、続いていますというところです。で、次に、3つ目ですね。すいません。教育と子どもの保護の、分野についてですね。で、こちらのスライドでは、この分野の、深刻な、状況を少し軽く、お伝えしたいと思います。現時点で教員1人当たり79人の児童を担当していて、標準の40人以下と比べて2倍近い、過密状況になっています。約40万人の児童がこの教育機器の影響を受けています。また子どもの保護を担うケースワーカーは、1人で143人の子どもを、担当しています。通常この標準の25人に比べて、6倍近い負担となっています。で、現場に当団体も現場に日本人の駐在員がいて、今日も、このセミナーに参加してくださってるんですけども、彼女からの報告では、ネグレクトの報告が増えているという声もあると。で、最近 WFP 支援が、減少したことを受けて、保護者からは、食事が、こちらのコラムですね、食事を1日1回に減らしているとか、学用品が買えず、学校に通わせられないといった切実な、声が、寄せられています。で、ワールドビジョンが最近リリースした報告書でも、食料不足の家庭の子どもは学校に通えなくなったり、労働や、早期結婚、家庭内暴力のリスクが高まることが、その報告書の中でも、示されています。で、教育の中断っていうのは子どもたちの、未来を奪うだけでなく、保護の仕組みそのものを、弱体させています。で、本当に駆け足でも、なんですけれども、今3つ、の事例を、見てきたんですけれども、ちょっと、この後のディスカッションに、備えて、ちょっとまとめますと、その分野は、違いますけれども、共通して見えてきたことは、この資金削減っていうのが、人々の基本的な生活、いろいろな分野で、直撃していると。で、現場からはですね、先ほどの一つ目の、事例では、鍋が空のままとか、あと二つ目の事例では、水を汲むのに3時間かかるとか、 あと3つ目、学校に行けないとかっていう、声が、寄せられています。これらの声は単なる、数字ではなくて、支援の届かない現実を、物語っています。で、写真はですね、この写真、この女の子はですね、ネンサちゃんなんですけれども、妹と一緒にですね、わずかな葉っぱですね、野菜ではなく、葉っぱと水で食事を作ろうとしている、様子です。私もこの写真を見たときに、もう本当に声が、出なくなりました。私も何回かこの場所に行ったことがあって、通常は豊かなんですけども、今年は、年明けてからですね、本当に少しちょろっと雨が降ったぐらいで、もう本当に、キャッサバとか植えても雨が降らないので全然成長しないっていうふうにですね、報告もあります。というところで、こういう状況なので、この後の時間ですね、本当にさらっと、事例共有させていただきましたけれども、こういった課題に対して私たちがどのように向き合っていくべきかっていうのを、一緒に考えていければなというふうに思っています。で、あれですね、小見野さんの方にもお戻ししますけど、ちょっとまずこの後にですね、問いかけというところで、このウェビナーがNGO2030 というところで、冒頭で、この、趣旨のことについて、ご説明いただきましたけども、これに、2030年に向けて、ちょっと3つの問いをですね、皆さんと一緒に考えていきたいなというふうに思っています。1つ目は、資金が減っても、支援の質は守れるか。で、現場の声をどう政策に反映させるか。で、NGO は何を優先し、何を変えるべきか。という3つのところをですね、皆さんと一緒に考えていければなというふうに思います。はい。小見野さん、お戻しします。これ、映したままでよろしいでしょうか。
はい。じゃあ、そのままにしといてください。
はい。
伊藤さん、ありがとうございました。本当に現場の切実な、状況をお伝えいただいたと思います。2016年でしたか、世界人道サミットでも、それを当時は、トルコのシリア難民だったり、今日はウガンダの、お話もいただきましたけれども、その難民の方々を受け入れて支援を行っている国々をどうやって世界は支えていくのかっていう、議論があったと思うんですよね。で、そういった世界人道サミットで約束したことが全く今できていないっていう現状。それから現場がこれ以上ないぐらい疲弊して、安全な場所に来れたと思った人たちに関しても、これから生きられる保証がない。それが現状だと思います。で、こういった本当に逼迫している現状っていうのが短期的な影響だけで済むわけがなくて、これから非常に長期的に連鎖的に悪影響になっていくことが予想されるな、と感じました。はい。時間もですね、ちょっと押しているんですけれども、伊藤さん、ここに書いてくださった質問に関して、ちょっとジェニファーの意見も聞いてみたいと思います。Jennifer, so there are three queries being posed from Ito-san here. Can we maybe get your thoughts, particularly in midst of all these difficulties, challenges that we're all facing? What do we have to prioritize and how shall we change from your perspective?
I think they're all useful questions, and it was very helpful to hear more from what's actually happening in contexts like Uganda. So thank you so much, Ichi-san, for that. I think one of the big questions at the moment is really thinking through, what does prioritization mean? And what are the different levels that we all need to be considering? There's a lot to be unpacking here. One is thinking about really who needs to be prioritized. And part of that is the worry at the moment that we're seeing a rollback on issues around diversity, inclusion, and equity, particularly coming from the US. So how do organizations continue to prioritize those who are most vulnerable and at risk? The second one is what sectors and services are really needed. And I think we hear a lot from communities that beyond priorities around food, which are becoming more immediate, as we've just heard about in Uganda, there's also the longer term priorities that people continuously ask for: more resilience, more education for their children, and livelihoods. So how do we marry up those voices with maybe some of the push coming from donors or the reset around life-saving and that remit? I think the third one is how organizations choose to deliver. So are they thinking about anticipating needs, or are they just responding to needs? Which way do they choose to do that delivery? Also, whether to give directly or to do things through local partners to a greater extent. And all these are elements that organizations can choose from, but really with an idea that prioritization has its trade-offs. You can't do everything at once. If you want to do life-saving, maybe that means the people-centered approach drops out a little bit. You want to do localization and locally led assistance. What does that mean for multilateral group approaches or for INGOs and their capacities and jobs? So there's a lot of different areas to be looking at. And I think when we prioritize, we have a certain value in mind, but we don't always tell each other what that is. So I think being more honest about what it is you as an organization see as the main priority, and not doing that in silos, but talking to each other about this. There's fewer resources in the sector, so to maximize that, there needs to be conversations and maximizing together rather than as individual organizations, and thinking about complementarity more than competition. So I think spaces like this that bring different organizations together are incredibly valuable, and I hope that you can continue talking to each other as these processes evolve. Thank you.
Jennifer. 伊藤さん、我々はこれからどういう変化を起こしていくべきなのか、現場をこう見ておられる伊藤さんの視点からも、これから我々が大事にしていくべきものに関して、少し考察をいただけますと幸いです。
ありがとうございます。まさに今、ジェニファーさんがおっしゃってた、やっぱりサイロっていうかもうね、今まで本当に私たちの団体、それぞれミッションを掲げて目的を持ってますけれども、本当にこれからやっぱりさらに、本当にコラボレーションって、前例がないところに、領地に私たち向かっていくっていうところもあって、本当に常にやっぱり今やってることが本当にこうフィットしてるのかどうかっていうことを振り返りつつ、切り込んでいくっていうか、で、あと NGO だけではなくて、ここには今回多分企業の方とか、アカデミアの方とかもいらっしゃるので、本当に海外ないところに一緒に本当にそこをですね、見つけていくっていうところで、やっぱりさらに本当にコラボレーション、連携、お互いチャレンジし合って、高め合っていく、国内外ですね。っていうところがやっぱり大切なのかなというふうに思いますし、さっき小野さんもおっしゃった、やっぱり雨が降る日にね、傘の準備と一緒でですね、やっぱり本当に短期的なバンドエイドではやっぱり解決できないってことはもうみんな少佐なので、ちょっとそこを本当に、お金をそこまでかけなくても何が可能なのか、ね、土壌の流出してるところに植林をするとか、本当にもう一回、もしかしたら新しいところに見つつ、あるいは過去でやってたグッドプラクティスとか、本当に環境保全っていうところもですね、気候変動にどう対応していくのかとかっていうところもですね、課題はたくさんある中、ちょっとそこを目を過去のグッドプラクティスを見ながら、でも前にですね、一緒に向かっていければなと思います。ありがとうございます。
はい、伊藤さんありがとうございます。今年は戦後80年ですか。第二次世界大戦が終わった後、日本も、非常に飢えてですね、そこから這い上がってきた、歴史があると思います。そういった、非常に苦しい状況に置かれている国々、地域が今多いからこそ、我々、日本、もっと何ができるのか、どういった貢献ができるのかっていうのを真剣に考えるべきだなと、私も思います。グローバルなトレンドがこうだから、日本も追従するとかいう、そういう簡単な話ではなくて、日本はその国際的なプレイヤーとして、どういう貢献をして、この危機を、みんなで、打開していくために何ができるのか、そういったことが、問われているような気がいたします。はい。今日はジェニファーさん、伊藤さん、貴重なお話、どうもありがとうございました。はい。それでは、高杉さん、お戻しいたします。
はい、ありがとうございます。ジェニファーさん、伊藤さん、小宮さん、ありがとうございました。本当にジェニファーさんからはマクロレベルなインパクトのあるレポートをご共有いただき、伊藤さんからですね、その数字が意味することは本当どういうことなのかっていうのを、現地の話を共有いただきましたが、主な食料を支援から得ている人がたくさんいて、その8割以上が子どもや女性っていう中で、本当にお二人のお話にもありましたけど、私たちが悲観的にならずにできること、さまざまなセクターが連携していけることを何か改めて一緒に考えていかねばならないと私も感じました。ありがとうございました。ですね、ここでですね、本日のイベントを一旦閉会させて7時になりましたのでいただきます。で、この後は録画を停止して、自由に参加できる放課後トークというお時間になります。で、議論のお時間がですね、あんまり取れませんでしたので、ぜひお話ししたい、もっと知りたいという方がいらっしゃいましたら、この後、このままお残りください。画面はオンでもオフでも構いませんので、気軽にご参加残っていただければと思います。はい、あとですね、本日のウェビナーに関する最後にアンケートを、チャットで、お送りします。今からお送りしますね。なので、登壇者の方々ですとか、はい、今後のためにもですね、励みになりますので、ぜひご協力よろしくお願いします。はい、皆様本日は改めてありがとうございました。このままお残りください。よろしくお願いします。